Well, who remembers what we covered last week? Do what? A lot. If you would, please make sure that your microphones are on. We are still making a few adjustments on the online recording, but it is helpful to have those on so that people can hear. Last week we covered about half of the Old Testament in one fell swoop. And I know it went very, very quickly, but I am not sure how I could have done the prophets without either digging into each and every one of them and spending a lot of time, or just a really quick overview. So we went with a really quick overview, finished out the Old Testament, and this week it is my intention to start the New Testament. In doing that, though, we recognize that there is some time that takes place between the last of the Old Testament prophets and the time of Christ. And so I want to take some time this evening and look at what's called the inter-testamental period, or the time between the testaments. And what's going on there, what difference does that make, what do we need to understand about that history and that cultural change that takes place. And then it's my goal, hopefully, to go through the Gospels and Acts. And so cover the history period between the Testaments and then the history period of the New Testament. So that's my goal. We will see how well that happens. Jan always laughs at me when I say that. Just smiling. Okay. As we get started on this, I do have a couple of verses that I want to look up and read. So if someone would find Exodus chapter 12. Exodus chapter 12, verse 11. And then we will also be looking at Luke chapter 22. But we're going to start with Exodus chapter 12. Just off the top of your head, does anyone know what's happening in Exodus chapter 12? Instituting the Passover. And so, what does Exodus 12, verse 11 say? Okay.
Now you shall eat it in this manner, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover.
Okay. So, Passover is major thing to the history of the Jews. It is that starts their year. Their calendar is based off of the preparation for Passover. They spend 14 days watching a lamb to make sure that it is fit as an offering for Passover. They then spend 7 days from the 14th to the 21st eating nothing but unleavened, well, not nothing, but eating only unleavened bread. They did not have any leaven in their house. They had to go through and make sure it was all gone. And they celebrated Passover as a remembrance of what God did to bring them out of Egypt. And so we looked at a single verse out of an entire chapter that deals with what they were supposed to do. But a couple of things I want you to notice. When they eat this, how are they supposed to do it? What are they supposed to be at this time? Their loins girded, ready to travel, their feet shod. This is not a sit down, relax, and enjoy. This is a, hey, here's what's going. We are remembering this event. Turn to Luke chapter 22. In Luke 22, Jesus is getting ready to observe the Passover. Throughout the Gospels, we see several times when he goes to Jerusalem for various feasts. One of 3 feasts where all Jews were required to gather together was Passover. And so this was a major event, and Jesus was looking forward to it. And in Luke chapter 22, verses 13 through 15, it says, if someone would read it for us. Okay, so physically, what's going on here? Well, yeah, that's the setting of what's going on, but it says they reclined at table. Wait a minute. Why? What's going on there? Why do we have this change from having your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, eating in haste, to this idea of reclining at table? And if we were to take a look at John chapter 13, we find out that they've had their feet washed. So they're not prepped and ready for going on a trip. They are relaxing and enjoying. Why? What's the cause of that? Well, that, as well as a lot of other changes, happen in the way that they observe these things because of this intertestamental period. It's largely the Pharisees, but a lot of the religious leaders have developed different ways of observing the non-essentials. They still sacrificed a clean, pure lamb. They still did it exactly where God told them to, at his temple. They still did it as all of the men of Israel gathered together like God had commanded. They're following the commands, but the method of observation has changed a little bit. And so why did they do that? Other things that we see added are the cups that they use. They have several specific drinks times when they are required to drink. There are 4 different cups that happen during the observation of Passover. Where does all that come from? Why do they do those things? Another couple of other questions that come up as you're reading the New Testament. Why is it that the scribes are the ones who are doing the teaching instead of the priests? Scribes are not priests. So what's going on there? Who are the Pharisees? They're going to come up over and over and over again. Well, who are they? Why are they in here? What about the tax collectors? Why, every time that we see tax collectors, are they connected with the sinners? What's going on there? What about in Acts chapter 22, we see Paul saying, hey, I am a citizen. Why are you beating me? Something's going on. There's some backstory going on there. One more verse that I want to look at in Acts chapter 23. In Acts 23, verses 6 through 10, Paul has had a little bit of a run-in with the leadership of the area. He is brought before the council, the Sanhedrin, and is being asked some questions. And verse 6 says, but perceiving that one part were Sadducees and the other part Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, Brethren, I am a Pharisee, son of a Pharisee. I am on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead. And as he said these things, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say, there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. And there arose a great uproar, and some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, We find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him. And a great dissension was developing, and the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. When we interpret Scripture, when we study Scripture, we need to understand the context. We need to understand what's going on. And one of the big parts of that context is the historical context. All of these questions that I've asked, all of these things that I've brought up, have answers. And most of that is found in understanding the historical events that take place in the intertestamental period. The Pharisees come up, the Sadducees come up, the Sanhedrin comes up. When in the New Testament we see places where they will quote the Old Testament, those quotations don't always line up with what we read in the Old Testament. So why is that? Why is it that we see, like I said, the tax collectors? What's the deal with the censuses that take place? Herod comes up. Who is Herod? Why is he a major player? What about Pilate? What's going on there? Why does Pilate send Jesus to Herod and not, because Pilate's the one who's in charge? So what's going on there? All of those types of questions. I hope that as you read through Scripture, you're asking these kinds of questions. Like, who is this? Why are they being mentioned? What's going on there? Those are the kinds of questions that you ought to be asking. But where do we find the answers? How do we understand what's going on there? A lot of those things are recorded in history outside of the Bible. They are extra-biblical, which means we don't ascribe to them the same level of reliance and information as we do the Bible. But when we come to understand those things, it helps us understand what the Bible's talking about. Who these major players are, what the groups are, what the history of them is. And so when we come to those passages that say Joseph and Mary had to go to Bethlehem because of the census that was being taken, we understand the historical context of what's happening and why that's such a major thing, what difference that makes, and oh, wait a minute. Because they followed the law and did what this random government that didn't care about God and didn't want to do God's ways, God's things, because they were obedient to that, they just fulfilled a prophecy that God had made some 300, 400, 500, 700 years previously. And God works all of this together in his major, massive, perfect, cool way in which he just orchestrates it all perfectly. How does he do that? That's what I want to take a little bit of time and dig into, the way in which he made all of that happen. Like I said, this is called the inter-testamental period. The reasons to understand it, it gives us an earliest interpretation of the Old Testament. We come to understand how the Jews understood what was going on, but it also gives us a lot of background to the New Testament, so that when we're studying it, we understand what's happening in the New Testament. The intertestamental period is a time between the Testaments. That's really all that it means. If you have your timesheet, we were looking at different dates throughout the history of Israel, and the last of the prophets, Malachi, is approximately 400 years before Christ. So we're talking about that time period between the last of the prophets who spoke from God and the arrival of Christ. Now this is often referred to as the silent years, but it's not silent in that God's not working. It's just silent in that he doesn't have anyone prophesying and giving his word. It's actually during this time that the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, change a lot politically, religiously, and socially. But it's also during these times that a lot of the prophecies of Daniel are fulfilled. Daniel chapters 2, 7, 8, and 11 all deal with things that are happening during this time frame. And all of these different empires that he prophesies are going to come up, that's what happens during this time frame. So God is fulfilling his prophecies. God is still at work. He's just not giving more an additional prophecy. Yes, ma'am?
Say that again. Israel changed
politically, religiously, and socially. Just their culture, the way that they functioned, changes during this time frame. For a variety of reasons, and that's what we're going to be looking at. Why would it have changed? Good example for us. In the United States, it's been 200 and some years since George Washington and the American Revolution. Has society changed? Has culture changed? Has the observation of religion, even Christians who love God, love his word, has the way that they function changed during that time frame? Yeah. All of those things have happened. And so as we look at our lives today, if we understand history, what has brought some of those things about, it makes more sense. So that's where I want to go, a very, very brief summary of the time frame of what happens. I say very brief. I know it's going to take a decent amount of time, but realize that's what this book is about. That's what this book is about. That's what this book is about, is understanding that time frame of what's going on between the Testaments. So we're not going through hundreds and hundreds of pages. Doctoral dissertations focus on this time frame and understanding what's happening. We're going to avoid that, I hope. So, I will give a few years and dates. You might want to jot them down at the bottom of your timeline just to help keep track of what's going on. Some of these are listed on there. For example, Jerusalem was destroyed in 587. That was something that we've been talking about. As a result, the Jews were scattered in exile throughout the kingdom of Babylon. Some of them were also sent into Egypt. You'll recall from some of what happens in the Old Testament. But the people of Israel are dispersed all over the place. And that is in direct fulfillment of God's prophecy. He had said, if you don't follow me, I will kick you out of the land. They didn't follow him. He said, you're gone for 70 years. But after that 70 years, God begins bringing them back. In 539 BC, Cyrus the Great, the leader of Persia, conquers Babylon. And with that shift, with that change in the political government, there's also a shift in the way that the Israelites are treated. Babylon had drugged them all out of Israel. But Cyrus and the Persians allow them to go back into Israel. Not only do they allow them to go back, they pay for the process of them rebuilding the temple. And they give them back a lot of the things that were taken out of the temple. So Persia helps reestablish Israel. And that's what we had been dealing with the last couple of weeks as we were going through the history. They allowed the Jews to go back and practice their religion, to rebuild the temple. And most of that event has been reviewed. You can find it in Chronicles and in Ezra and in Nehemiah. Well, that's included in the text of Scripture. What comes after that isn't, but it sets up what we see happening in the New Testament. In 334 BC, there was a man by the name of Alexander the Great. Anybody ever heard of him? He starts the empire of Greece, and at 20 years old, he launches an offensive that basically wipes out most of the known world, takes over everything. He defeats Darius, the king of Persia, in 333 BC. Then he goes on to conquer Tyre, which is the northern part of Israel, and then all the way through down into Egypt, and then he heads east. But in 323 BC, at the age of 32, he dies. Now, during his lifetime, Alexander required that Greek culture be taught everywhere that he conquered. The Greek language be the language that's used everywhere that he conquered. He allowed for religious freedom, but he promoted the Greek lifestyle. And so, as a result, everybody then is speaking Greek, is reading Greek, is living. The term that comes up in the New Testament is Hellenized. They become Greek. That's the language, that's the style, that's the modern way of living is Greek. And so in that society, the Jews then have to decide, are we going to be Greek or are we going to be Jews? What are we going to do? Are we going to follow the Old Testament law or are we going to follow the culture? Even today, we're faced with that same question. Are we going to follow God's word or are we going to follow the culture? Well, there are things, modern day, that are cultural that aren't against the Bible. Most of us are wearing several of us are wearing a button-up t-shirt. Well, buttons are a modern cultural type thing. Pants are a modern cultural type thing. Those are not anti or against the Bible. And so a lot of the Jews take different tacks on how they're going to do this, how they're going to live like Greeks but also live like Jews. Well, just like in a lot of other societal discussions, that creates a lot of arguments. Well, with the death of Alexander, his empire was divided up. It was actually divided by 4 different of his generals. We're only worried about 2 of them because Seleucid is one, Ptolemy is the other. The dividing line between their 2 empires is Israel. That works out well for about 120 years. From 323 BC till 200 BC, Israel was under the Ptolemy Empire. They had a lot of peace. They had freedom of religion. They got to do what they wanted to do. And then in 200 BC, the Seleucid kingdom has a major battle at Mount Hermon and takes over the area. Yes.
When you speak of like 323 BC,
Mm-hmm.
and then you go to 200 BC, do they do their years as a countdown?
Yes. All of the calendar years count down to the time of Christ. So from Christ, it counts up. BC is how many years before Christ. AD is how many years after Christ. Yes. And even in modern day, they call it BCE and CE, but because they don't want to tie it to before Christ and after his, or the year of our Lord is what the words are. But it still has Christ as the center point. There's no getting away from it. And so yes. So 200 years before Christ is when the Seleucid kingdom takes over. Well, SELEUCID.
And that's you said it was the dividing line between those two empires?
Was Israel.
It becomes the Seleucid area, which is Israel?
Yeah. So Israel was, for the first 120 years, was part of the northern empire, but then the southern empire had a battle that took over and shifted where the boundary line was. And so, yeah.
Ptolemy is spelled how?
Ptolemy. It's got a silent P. I don't know why. So, under the first empire, the Jews are treated pretty well. Under the second empire, they are not. Did you have a question or comment?
That's a smart remark.
Okay.
The P is like the end of the fish. Move on.
Okay. So, from that point on, the Jews...
Just like there's a P in that way in this side, but there is no M
in fish.
in fish. Even though-
Anyway.
Yeah.
So the Jews had it decent under the first, but under the second, the rulers wanted to completely get rid of religion. They did not want religious freedom. They did not want religious expression. And so the Jews were oppressed under this new set of rulers, to the point that we have a major historical figure, Antiochus Epiphanes, technically he's the fourth, in 167, who goes into the temple, which no one but the Jews were supposed to go in, and sacrifices, which no one but the priests are supposed to sacrifice, a pig, which is not a clean animal. So he walks in and basically desecrates the temple. Oh, and he offers the pig to Zeus and not to Yahweh. This is Antiochus Epiphanes. Yes. And so there is a lot of discussion that this is fulfillment of some of the prophecy as well. This is a desecration of the temple. This is a horrible thing that he does. Well, obviously the Jews are not happy about that. And so the following year starts a Jewish uprising called the Maccabean Revolt. This revolt was led by a lowly country priest. But he and his followers became known as the Maccabees, and they successfully obtained independence for Israel. They got their freedoms back, and they cleaned up the temple, and historically this becomes the Hanukkah festival. So Hanukkah is still celebrated today because of what this guy and his followers did to clean up and reconsecrate the temple. During the next roughly 100 years, there's a lot of peace and prosperity that happens relatively within the Israelites, and during this time there's a lot of factions within the Israelite community that come up. Now, I use the term factions. Modern day, we would probably call them denominations. So think the Presbyterians and the Baptists and the Episcopals and the Anglicans. They all have certain similarities. They all call themselves Christians. There's infighting between them, but there's a vast difference between those four and an atheist or a humanist or things of that nature. So I'm not saying that these four groups agree entirely, but they're not completely at odds with each other, though they'll argue amongst themselves a lot. And this is a very, very oversimplification. But the Zealots are a group that come about who think that they can usher in the kingdom of God, that through their military might, they will bring about God's kingdom. Their goal is to overthrow any empire that's ruling over them and to get rid of all pagan idols and to get rid of any kind of practices within their land that are not focused on God. They're zealots. Is it? Yes. This is from about 160 BC on, roughly. There's another group called the Essenes that believe that they need to withdraw from everything. That God is going to bring in his kingdom and his plan without their help. And so obviously there's a difference between the Zealots who think they go out and fight and they make it happen, and the Essenes who step back and say, no, we don't do anything. We let God take care of all of it. They end up becoming a very monastic group. They go out, hide in the hills, spend all their time reading and praying and copying, and as a result, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a community, ESSENES. ES. So they are the ones who, Essenes, yeah. They're the ones who recorded the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're the ones who made lots of the copies that result in us knowing for sure that the Old Testament that we have is the same Old Testament that the Jews originally had, that God had initially given, is all of the copies that they made. We then also have the Pharisees, which they believed in a radical personal holiness. They weren't as worried about the politics that the other two were. They were worried about their religion, and they wanted to be completely and totally pure. I'm sorry. The Pharisees. Pharisees. Yes. They start about this time frame, about 160 AD. Now, BC. About 160 BC. There's not a definitive, it happened on this date. It's just these groups kind of developed during this time when they now have peace. They now have prosperity. They can now focus on their religion and serving God instead of, under the previous ruler, not being allowed to have any religious freedom, not being allowed to do anything that they wanted to do. So the Pharisees, they want to internalize the religious law. They want to live well. And they believe that God will reward that in the afterlife. And one of the passages, the Acts 13 that I read, 23 that I read, focuses on that idea. The Pharisees believed that there was an afterlife. They believed that there would be a resurrection. On the other hand, we have the Sadducees who did not. That's the fourth group that I'm going to mention. The Sadducees believed in the establishment. They made peace with whoever was in charge. The Romans is who's coming up, but whoever was in charge, and they wanted to do the ritual. That was their focus. But they also believed that all of God's rewards are in this life. There is no afterlife. There is nothing future. It's only where we are right now.
Which made them very sad.
Exactly. That's just Jim, just smiling on. Yeah. Well, so, I mean, the same way that a lot of our denominations in the United States have come up with theirs, some of it is they don't actually read what the Bible says. Some of it, they read it and interpret it differently. And so there's a wide breadth amongst these folks and different reasons and all kinds of stuff. My point is simply that they exist. and that these groups are all at work during this time frame. During all of this, there's a lot of literature that comes about. A lot of writing happens. Mostly, it's the Pharisees and the Essenes that do that writing. The Sadducees don't really write very much. But there's a lot of other stuff that comes about. That's going to become important here in a little bit. So Israel was semi-independent for about 100 years until Rome becomes the major world power. Rome comes onto the scene, they take over, and that's the political climate that we find out about when Christ is born. 63 BC. Yep. That's when Rome invades Israel under the Roman general Pompey. Famous historical figure, you don't need to know his name. So they take over Israel, and now Israel has to follow Roman law and Roman customs. Israel was ruled by governors until 39 BC, when Rome appointed Herod the Great. Now, Herod the Great becomes very significant because that is who was in charge when Jesus was born. Herod is an interesting individual. He does a lot of really nice things. The temple, when Christ was around, was Herod's temple. That's this guy. He has major construction projects and pours tons of money into this. He enlarges the size. He makes everything beautiful. He really, really helps out. And then he kills off at least 3 of his sons, 2 of his wives, and all of the babies under 2 years old, as you recall from the New Testament. So he's really a mixed bag. He does some really nice things and a lot of terrible things. He ends up dying in 4 BC.
Good.
He had 3 sons that his kingdom has been divided amongst. And those descendants of Herod come up throughout the New Testament. Those various groups, there's a lot of different things that go on, and they are in different areas, and it would take a lot of going through to identify who's who and what's going on with each of them.
Just before you go any further,
Yeah.
Herod dies in 4 BC, you said?
Yes.
How did he then kill the children?
The dating system isn't exactly perfect. Yeah. The BC and AD was supposed to hit right when Jesus was born, but it's about 6 years off. Yeah. And that's because of number of days in a year, the various ways that dates were counted and stuff like that. So, okay, all right. It's not quite spot on, but it's close. So Herod the Great dies. He leaves the empire to his 3 sons, who divide it up, and each of them is in a different area. One of them, 3 sons.
Oh, 3.
3 sons. One of them is over the area of Jerusalem. One of them is over the area of Galilee, and the third one is over the area kind of to the northeast of Galilee. Those 2 areas become very significant because the one in Jerusalem, there's yet another Jewish revolt against him. The Romans have to come in and take over, and that's why we see Pilate as a procurator, as the person in charge, ruling in that area. So, when we get to the New Testament, we find out that Jesus is taken before Pilate because they're having a trial for him in Jerusalem. But Pilate, he's kind of on shaky ground because he doesn't want to make the Jews mad, but he also doesn't want to make the Romans mad. There's been so many uprisings that he's looking at this and he wants to wash his hands of the whole thing. He doesn't want to have to deal with it. And then he realizes that Jesus is a Galilean, which means he can pawn this off on Herod's son, Herod Antipas, and make him deal with it instead of Pilate having to deal with it. And so all of that is caused by this intertestamental period and the way in which the politics and the history all fit together that result in this stuff happening. And so when Jesus is on the scene, we see all of these interactions between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, between the Romans. When we get to the book of Acts, we see the Hellenized people not being cared for the way that the Jews were being cared for. We see Paul dealing with a bunch of different areas that he travels to. Paul's a Roman citizen. What does that mean? How does that all fit together? All of that is explained by this intertestamental period as we begin to understand the history, the historical setting of the New Testament. Now, I know that I just dumped a ton of information, and it was very, very fast. I'm sorry for that. I hope that you got some of the highlights. It's one of those, like I said, you could spend a lot of time digging into all of this. I would encourage you not to do too much research because you will get lost. But do a little bit to kind of have a general idea of what's happening. Yes, ma'am.
You're reading from notes,
Yes.
right?
You want a copy of my notes?
Do you have your notes?
I will clean up my notes a little bit and make you a copy. Yes.
No, I don't think it's just me that wants a copy.
Okay. Okay.
So,
Yes, I will.
I not until now when we were talking about this. Pharisees and Sadducees there were no such thing in the Old Testament.
Nope.
Because we don't know where they came from, and why all of a sudden they had such importance in the beginning of the New Testament.
Yep.
When we had never heard of them before, that it's all happened within that 400 years. See, I did take notes. I wasn't just sitting here listening.
No, I saw you writing furiously.
As far as spelling and abbreviating things, it would be helpful.
If you would be so kind, let me clean these up a little bit.
Of course,
My notes are not.
I was just that.
Okay.
I
Okay.
will
I can do
gladly
that.
wait.
Yes, ma'am.
So if somebody wanted to do light research into this, do you have anything you would recommend?
Yes, good question.
Because if we just Google intertestament period,
Yeah, you're going to end up with all kinds of
Is
all
it
kinds of
possible
stuff.
to do light research?
I will include in the notes some of the references or resources that I used to get this. Yes.
Okay.
Does Josephus,
I'm about to go
any of
there.
this?
I'm about to go there. Yes.
Okay, because
Yeah.
I have a book on Josephus.
So, couple of things. Key takeaways. I understand that this can be very overwhelming, that there's tons of things, and it would become a major research project. The main things that I want you to take away from it, understanding the intertestamental period allows us to see the culture of the New Testament world. By understanding this stuff that I just went through, we understand what's going on in the New Testament. We see the backdrop. We see when Levi is at the tax collector's booth, why is it that nobody likes him, and yet Jesus says, "Follow me"? When Jesus then goes into his house and has a meal with him, why are the Pharisees looking at that and saying, "That's not okay"? Because who are the Pharisees? Who are the tax collectors? Why? The short version of that is the Pharisees don't like Rome. They want to live a pure, completely set apart life so that God will do what he's going to do. The tax collectors work for Rome and are generally not very honest, and everybody hates them. They are considered the scum of the earth. And so by Jesus going into his house, he has now become ceremonially unclean. That opens up our understanding of what's going on, and should then cue in our minds, wait a minute, if Jesus is willing to sit down with the scum of the earth and have a meal with him, what does that tell us about Jesus? The love of Christ extends to everyone. This isn't limited just for the elites, for the clean, for the nice, for the religious. In fact, Jesus is going to teach that I didn't come for the healthy, I came for the sick. I came for the ones who are outcasts, and I want them to understand. So there's tons more, obviously, but yes, sir.
And the other question I have in that is, why were the Pharisees there to notice it if it was such a bad? I mean,
Well,
maybe they were outside.
they were probably outside looking in, saw him go into that situation.
Okay.
But yeah.
Rumors.
Okay, so by understanding the intertestamental period, we understand the culture of the New Testament world. We also, it allows us to know the language that they spoke. Why was it that the New Testament is written in Greek? Because Alexander required everyone to learn Greek. When he built his empire, now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, obviously we can look at forcing people to do things and all of the negatives there, but it results in the fact that the entire world of Rome knew Greek. So when Paul then goes out to preach the gospel, most people are able to understand him. When Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John write their gospels, most people who are able to read the language of the people. It's called Koine Greek. Yes, sir.
So the people, the Jewish people that are in Jerusalem are bilingual.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Some of them even more so. There's
Yeah, especially
good
if
probability that they were trilingual or
All
more.
the tongues that are going on in that area.
Yep.
especially those that were in the trade business.
Yes.
In port cities, they had a lot of languages.
Yep. But Greek was the major trade language that everybody would understand.
Right.
Yes, ma'am.
Have you gone into Septuagint yet, or planning?
Nope. I'm going to.
Okay.
I will get to that shortly. Understanding the intertestamental period helps us understand why the Jews felt the way that they did. The culture of what's going on helps us understand why are there zealots? Why is there this fighting? Why do some of the Jews like the Romans and some of the Jews hate the Romans? Why, when they go into the book of Acts and they start going out to the Gentiles, why does that cause such a problem that Peter backs away from even having a meal with Gentiles instead of embracing the Gentiles, and Barnabas, and why does Paul have to rebuke them? And I mean, all of that opens up our understanding as we understand this historical impact. Another thing that comes up a lot is the intertestamental literature, or the writings. I said a lot of that was done by the Pharisees. One that Tiff mentioned was the Bible translations. During that time frame, that 100 and some years prior, they started translating the Bible into other languages, including Greek. That translation is known as the Septuagint. It was the primary translation of the Old Testament. Septuagint means 70. It's the simplest way to render the number of people who translated it. LXX is what you'll see if somebody mentions it. On Blue Letter Bible, you'll see at the bottom or top, when you are looking at a Hebrew section, you go down to the bottom and it'll say LXX and have it in Greek. That's the Septuagint rendering. So for those Greek scholars who want to understand the Old Testament, that's what they used. It was begun in 275 BC by a group of religious Jews that spoke Greek and wanted to translate the Old Testament into a language that everyone would then be able to understand, because Alexander had required everyone to learn Greek, and so they wanted it to still be accessible. During this time period, like I said, we also have the Dead Sea Scrolls. During this 400 silent years, we also have what's called the Apocrypha. You've probably heard of it. Catholics really like it. It is interesting reading, historical in nature, not inspired. That's where the major difference is. Is it possible to have something that's written that is true? Yeah. How do we know who George Washington was? Because somebody wrote it down, and we know that it's true. But just because it's true doesn't mean that it was inspired. So there are parts of the Apocrypha that are true. They record historical events that actually happened. There's also parts of the Apocrypha that are clearly made-up stories. And oftentimes it admits to that, and it's willing to say that, but the Apocrypha, and then there's another group of books called the pseudepigrapha. I'm not going to spell it, just books under a false name. So the book of Enoch is a good example. Enoch didn't write that book, but it's ascribed to Enoch. So it's using him as a pseudonym, as a fake name. Again, those can be interesting. There's nothing wrong with reading them, but they're not the Bible. And that's where the issue comes up, is some people say, oh, well, they're inspired. They are of equal weight. They are of equal value. No, they are not. They are not part of Scripture. The simplest explanation for that I've ever come up with or ever heard is when Jesus talks about the Bible, when he quotes the Bible, when he's asked about the Bible, he references a lot of Old Testament. He references the law, the prophets, and the writings, which are the three sections that we studied. He never mentions anything from the Apocrypha or the pseudepigrapha. They just aren't, in his view, Scripture. They may be good, they may be interesting, but they're not Scripture. Now, when we get into the rest of the New Testament, we do see Paul referencing people who lived, and philosophers and other writers, and some quotes do come up that look like they might be from the Apocrypha. Well, if Paul's quoting a modern-day philosopher, or of his day philosopher, that he's not saying that philosopher is inspired by God. He's just using him as a reference, like, hey, you guys understand what this guy said. Let me explain it in God's terms. And so that's one of the things that comes up during this time. There are also several Jewish writers that have lots of writing. Philo is one of them, Philo. He is a contemporary of Jesus. And so he's writing a lot of his things at the same time. Most of his work is exposition of the Old Testament, explaining it, helping people understand it, commentaries, etc. The other one that comes up is Josephus, who he comes around in the latter half of the 1st century. So the time that Paul is writing and that John is writing, when the Bible's being written, he is also writing. He writes histories. He writes one that's called the Jewish War, and one called Antiquities. And those are the writings from which we get a lot of our understanding of how the Jews lived, why they did what they did, where all of this history comes from. The other thing that comes up during this time frame is what's called the rabbinical literature. When we deal with the Pharisees, they are relying on oral tradition, right? Well, all of that gets written down. It's written down as the Mishnah, which is commentaries on the Old Testament law. Do what?
What?
The rabbinical literature, what the rabbis wrote. And so during Sundays, I'm going through the Gospel of Mark, right? And I reference the Pharisees and the scribes, and the way that they would teach is Rabbi so-and-so says, ... Well, all of those are the traditions, the oral traditions that they have recorded through the years. Some of those go all the way back to very early in the Old Testament, when so-and-so said, so-and-so said, so-and-so said, so-and-so said. That's not to say that they're wrong always, but it would be like me saying, well, according to Charles Ryrie, according to John MacArthur, according to fill in the blank, are those good men? Yeah. Are they often right? Yeah. Is what they say the exact same thing and of as much weight as the Bible? No. If you ask them, they would say, no, don't take my word for it. Go to the Bible. Well, the rabbis, the Pharisees, they started going to these guys instead of to the Bible. And that's where they get off a lot of times. So they had three different sets. The Mishnah, which is commentaries on the law. It's like us reading commentary today. The Talmud, which is commentaries on those commentaries. And then what's called Midrashim it's their discussions. And so they would get the wise individuals together, and they would, one would say, okay, according to this Old Testament book, this rabbi says that such and such is how this plays out. Well, yes, but according to this person, this is how this happens, and therefore, and they would have these discussions back and forth. Discussions can be very valid. If the guys have discussions on Sunday nights, if we were to record those, write them down, and publish that as a book, that would be what this is. Same idea. Is it Scripture? No. That's the problem. That's where the rabbis run into issues. But we understand what the Pharisees thought and taught by understanding what these things are saying. When we encounter Jews even today, we understand what they believe because of these. And these are what help us understand why they don't believe the Bible as well. And so that's where we run into a lot of issues. So, that was a lot of information, very, very quickly. We covered 400 years worth of history that sets up and lays the foundation for when Jesus comes on the scene. Why do we see these things happening? What is the Roman Empire? Why are they there? Well, the explanation of that comes from this intertestamental period. As I mentioned, and I went by it very quickly, but I want to go back and emphasize it. There are prophecies in the Old Testament that point to Christ, that had to be fulfilled in order to verify that when Jesus is born, he is the promised Messiah. He is the one that everything from the Old Testament was pointing to as the fulfillment. But in order for that to happen, certain geopolitical events had to take place. They had to be in the right place at the right time for all of this to fit together. And we start seeing, no, God was not giving more revelation. He was not sending prophets to talk to people, but he was still active and at work, getting all of these things lined up just right so that the Romans would be in the right place, so that the Greeks would be in the right place, so that the Israelites would be in the right place, so that the events that take place where the Israelites had kind of become very laissez-faire and they weren't taking things seriously until Antiochus Epiphanes goes in and desecrates the temple, and they all come together and are like, hey, this is not okay, and they have a major revolt that gets that out of there, reestablishes the temple so that everything's in place and ready to go at the time that Jesus shows up. Even to the point of Rome taking over and putting Herod in charge, and Herod does terrible, evil, vile, wicked things that accomplished what God's plan was. No, God does not establish sin. God does not cause that to be. But even those things, God is able to use to make his plans come to happen. And so, all of that to say, as we go into our look and overview at the New Testament, bear in mind that God has been at work through this entire time frame, getting things set up so that his goals and his plans will be accomplished. And when we read through the New Testament, understanding those things opens our eyes to understand, okay, we see the Pharisees, they didn't just pop onto the scene. They have some history and some background and some reason for why they're acting the way that they act. We see the Sadducees pop up, and yet there's a good reason for that. The council is the Sanhedrin is what it's called. Where does that come from, and why does that happen? All of these things are the Jews getting ready for God's Messiah to come, but then they miss it. God did everything, and he got it set up just right, and they missed the boat, and they didn't understand it. But God is gracious, and he records for us all of these things so that even now, 2,000 years later, we can look back and verify historically that yes, the things in the Bible are accurate, and verify historically that yes, we actually have good copies of what the Bible has, and then dig in and understand, okay, this is what God has revealed for the church age, for his followers in this time frame. What are we supposed to know? What are we supposed to understand? How are we then to live as a result of that? And ultimately, what are we looking forward to? We spent, year and a half, 2 years studying the book of Revelation. Well, all of that also happens in this same context of what's going on to get that set up so that John would then be able to tell us, hey, it doesn't end here. There's more to come. And that's what we're looking forward to. So, I know that was a whole lot. Any questions real quick? Yes, go ahead.
What did the Romans stand to gain by controlling Israel?
In part, it was the crossroads of the ancient world. There was a lot that happens down in Egypt, and the land route to bring any of those supplies and stuff goes up through Israel. There's a lot that happens out in the east, out in Babylon and Persia and all of that. The trade routes go right by Israel to get from there to Rome. And so by land.
But I mean,
yes.
the sea's right there where Egypt is. Why didn't they transport things on ships?
Some of it does. Some does transport by ship. But a lot of the ships of that time frame couldn't necessarily traverse all the way across. We look at the life of Paul. He gets shipwrecked multiple times. The Mediterranean Sea is not a safe place for shipping. So if they wanted to make sure that it would get there, they'd load it up on camels and go on around.
But also, as we saw in our Sunday school, we learned that the routes through Israel, a lot of these countries, these empires, wanted to control those routes to keep them safe, and that's where their militaries would travel through. Military didn't travel by ship; they traveled by land, and so they wanted control and they wanted security for their people, and so it was fought over constantly.
Yep. And just general power grabs. They wanted to be in charge. I mean, there is a level of that as well. Yep. Good question. Any others?
I think that was very, very, very.
Yeah, could you go through that again, please?
No, but it will be recorded on YouTube, and you can find it on our website.
Okay.
Cascade Bible Church. No, Cascade Church Lapine.net.
No, Lapine.
CascadeChurch.net. Yes.
Where did the word rabbi come about? Is that Pharisee, Sadducee? Is it just a teacher or?
Rabbi just means teacher. I would have to do a word study on that to know exactly where it comes from.
But it's a Pharisee. Could it be a Pharisee and a Sadducee?
It would be any of the teachers. So any of these groups would have rabbis who would instruct them in it.
Okay.
He's a rabbi.
It's the beard.
No, rabbi.
Not really. It's just a term to mean a teacher or an instructor. Yep. Any other questions?
That's right.
All right, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you. Thank you for your word. As we study it, as we learn of it, Lord, help us to understand the context. Help us to understand the historicity of it. Help us to understand the language. Help us to be able to understand what you have revealed and preserved for us. Lord, evenings like this where we get to deal with some interesting historical facts and figures and such can be really, really interesting. And so thank you for history. Thank you for learning. But Lord, help us to always keep our eyes focused on your word. Help us to use these other things to be able to understand it better, to dig into it deeper, to love it more, to draw closer to you because of it. So thank you for our time that we've had. Pray that you would guide us as we head out from here, that we would not only learn things for the sake of having it in our heads, but that we would be willing to be changed by you, to be challenged by you, that as we read our Bibles individually, that we would love you more and serve you better throughout the remainder of this week. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.